The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beeping of machines monitoring Eddie Carson's vital signs. At 82 years old, Eddie was living his final days. The terminal diagnosis had come swiftly, like much of the life he'd lived, without warning, without mercy. It was a cold January morning, the kind where the sun barely bothered to pierce the heavy gray clouds outside. Yet, on this particular day, something extraordinary was happening. Something no one at the hospital could have anticipated. A horse, tall and majestic, stood in the hallway just outside Eddie's room. The animal's coat gleamed even in the dim fluorescent light, and a bright blue ribbon hung from its bridle. The ribbon bore the number 131. His name was Rebel. But to Eddie, Rebel was far more than just a horse. He was the last living link to a life filled with love, adventure, and unbreakable bonds with the land Eddie had called home for decades. When Rebel was gently guided into the hospital room, silence fell over everyone present. Doctors, nurses, and even visitors paused to watch. This wasn't just an unusual sight, it was a farewell. Eddie, lying weak and frail in the bed, turned his head slowly toward the doorway. His tired eyes, dulled by weeks of pain and exhaustion, suddenly sparkled with recognition and joy. "Rebel! You came, boy," Eddie whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. The horse stepped forward cautiously, as if he somehow understood the gravity of the moment. The sharp, sterile scent of antiseptics was suddenly replaced by the earthy smell of hay and fresh air, a reminder of the life Eddie had lived before these white walls and cold machines became his reality. To those watching, it seemed like a touching reunion between a man and his beloved horse. But for Eddie, it was so much more. This was the culmination of a lifetime of memories. A lifetime of sunrises spent riding across open fields, of long days working the land with Rebel at his side. With a trembling hand, Eddie reached out, his fingertips brushing the warm, familiar muzzle of the horse. "Do you remember, boy? When it was just the two of us, running through the fields?" Eddie murmured, his voice barely audible. Rebel's deep brown eyes seemed to glimmer in response. He didn't need words. His calm presence spoke louder than anything he could have said. The room was filled with a heavy, reverent silence. As Eddie gently stroked Rebel's face, tears slipped down his cheeks. He knew this was goodbye. In the back of the room, a nurse stood quietly, holding her breath. There was something in Eddie's expression, something bittersweet. It was as if he'd finally found peace, knowing he could leave this world having seen his loyal companion one last time. But what happened next was something no one could have foreseen. Rebel stood quietly beside Eddie's bed, his powerful frame somehow gentle in the sterile hospital room. Eddie's frail hand rested on the horse's muzzle, his fingers tracing the familiar curve of Rebel's face. The warmth of the animal's breath brought Eddie a strange sense of comfort, pulling him back to memories of open fields and simpler days. Rebel wasn't just a horse. He was the last piece of a life Eddie had fought to hold on to, even as time and circumstance had chipped it away. Eddie's mind drifted to the day he first saw Rebel. The colt was wild and untamed, all fire and defiance. "This one's trouble," the rancher had warned, but Eddie saw something different. "We'll figure each other out," he had said, and that was exactly what they did. Over the years, Rebel became more than a workhorse. He became Eddie's partner, his confidant. Together, they had plowed fields, endured storms, and raced under endless blue skies. Rebel was always there, steady and strong, even when everything else began to fall apart. A soft sigh escaped Eddie's lips as the weight of regret settled in his chest. "I should have let you go, boy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You deserved more than I could give you." Rebel flicked his ears, his dark eyes fixed on Eddie as if to say he didn't need anything else. Eddie felt the sting of tears welling up, the kind that came from a lifetime of mistakes he couldn't take back. Linda, the nurse who had cared for Eddie these past weeks, stood quietly in the corner, her heart heavy as she watched the scene unfold. She had heard countless stories about Rebel during Eddie's time in the hospital, but seeing the two of them together brought those tales to life. It wasn't just a bond, it was a lifeline, a connection that had endured when so many others had faded. Eddie turned his head slightly toward Linda, his expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. "Promise me," he said softly, "that he'll be free. No stables, no auctions. He needs the fields." Linda felt her throat tighten, but she nodded. "I promise," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't need to ask why it mattered so much. She already knew. Rebel shifted slightly, lowering his head until his muzzle pressed against Eddie's chest. The horse let out a soft, low whinny that seemed to carry years of understanding and forgiveness. Eddie's hands stilled as his eyes closed, his breathing slowing to a peaceful rhythm. In that moment, the hospital room faded away, leaving only the unshakable bond between a man and his horse, a bond that even time couldn't break. Linda stood silently by the hospital bed, her eyes darting between Eddie's peaceful face and Rebel's towering frame. The horse seemed unusually still, as if aware of the gravity of the moment. Eddie's words echoed in her mind. "Promise me he'll be free." It wasn't a simple request. It was a plea born from love and guilt, and Linda felt the weight of it settle heavily on her shoulders. As Rebel shifted his hooves against the cold tile floor, Linda approached the horse cautiously. She'd grown up around animals, but never had she encountered one with such presence. Rebel turned his head toward her, his dark eyes steady and almost searching. She reached out hesitantly, her hand brushing against his neck, and was surprised at how calm he remained. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" she murmured, her voice breaking slightly. In the hallway, murmurs of hospital staff and onlookers began to fade as they returned to their duties, but Linda remained rooted to the spot. She couldn't shake the feeling that this moment demanded more of her than simply fulfilling a dying man's request. Rebel wasn't just a horse. He was the embodiment of Eddie's entire life. To Linda, ensuring his freedom felt like ensuring Eddie's legacy. The soft click of hooves on the floor broke her thoughts. A man dressed in a gray jacket appeared in the doorway, holding Rebel's lead. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat slightly, "I've got to take him back now." Linda turned toward him, suddenly defensive. "Take him back where?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "The stable," the man replied. "He's been boarding at a ranch nearby since Eddie was admitted. I've been looking after him." There was no malice in his tone, but Linda's chest tightened at the thought of Rebel spending his remaining days confined to a small stall, far from the open fields Eddie had dreamed of for him. "No," she said firmly, shaking her head. "That's not what Eddie wanted. He wanted Rebel to be free." The man hesitated, frowning slightly. "Free," he repeated, clearly unsure of what she meant. Linda took a deep breath, steadying herself. "There has to be a way," she said, more to herself than to him. Her mind raced, already piecing together a plan. Rebel didn't belong in a stable. He belonged in the fields Eddie had talked about so often. As she gently stroked Rebel's neck, she made a silent vow. She would find a way to honor Eddie's wish, no matter what it took. Later that evening, Linda sat alone in the hospital staff lounge, her mind racing. The image of Eddie lying peacefully with Rebel by his side refused to leave her thoughts. She couldn't ignore the promise she had made. Eddie's words, "he needs the fields," echoed in her ears like a solemn vow. But how could she, a nurse with no resources or connections, ensure Rebel's freedom? She pulled out her phone and began searching for sanctuaries, open pastures, or anyone who might take in an aging horse. The search was overwhelming. Dozens of facilities charged steep fees for boarding, and the sanctuaries with open land were either full or miles away from Eddie's small rural community. Frustration welled up inside her. This wasn't just about keeping a promise. It was about honoring the bond between Eddie and Rebel. Anything less felt like a betrayal. The next day, Linda visited Eddie's room before her shift began. The air felt colder without Rebel's presence, and the room was eerily quiet. She glanced at Eddie, his fragile body looking smaller than ever beneath the thin hospital blanket. Though his eyes remained closed, His face looked serene, as if knowing Rebel had been there had given him peace. Linda leaned closer and whispered, "I'll find a way, Mr. Carson. I swear." Determined, she reached out to one of the hospital's social workers, a woman named Karen, who had a reputation for solving impossible problems. Linda explained Eddie's wish, her voice trembling with urgency. Karen raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Finding a place for an older horse isn't easy," she said, tapping her pen against her desk. "Even if you could, the logistics of getting him there would be complicated." "I'll handle the logistics," Linda said firmly. "I just need to find the right place." Karen sighed, her expression softening as she saw the conviction in Linda's eyes. "All right," she said, reaching for her phone. "Let me make some calls. But don't get your hopes up too high, okay?" As the hours passed, Linda clung to hope, though doubt crept in with every rejection Karen received. Sanctuary after sanctuary turned them away, citing full capacity or financial constraints. Just as Linda began to feel like she had hit a dead end, Karen's phone buzzed with a message. Karen glanced at it and then looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "There's a small farm about 40 miles away," she said. "They take in rescue animals, and they're willing to take Rebel. It's not much, but it's open land." Relief washed over Linda, but her resolve only strengthened. She still had to make this happen, and quickly. The following morning, Linda stood in the hospital parking lot, clutching her coat against the biting wind. Rebel stood nearby, tied to the trailer of the man who had been caring for him. His massive frame seemed out of place against the backdrop of cars and pavement, but his calm demeanor gave Linda the strength she needed. Today, she would fulfill Eddie's final wish. The man in the gray jacket, whose name was Tom, approached her with a concerned expression. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his hands resting on the trailer's side. "That farm is a good 40 miles out. You're cutting it close if you're planning to get back here for your shift." Linda nodded, her jaw set with determination. "It doesn't matter how far it is. Eddie wanted Rebel to be free, and I promised him I'd make it happen." She glanced at Rebel, his ears flicking as if he understood every word. "This is the least I can do." Tom sighed but didn't argue further. Together, they loaded Rebel into the trailer, the horse stepping up with surprising ease. Linda couldn't help but marvel at how calm Rebel seemed, as though he, too, knew this journey was necessary. Once Rebel was secured, Linda climbed into the passenger seat of Tom's truck. The two set off down the long, winding country road, the trailer rattling softly behind them. The drive was quiet at first, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional groan of the trailer over potholes. Linda stared out the window, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. She thought of Eddie's stories about the farm, the life he'd poured into his land, and the way Rebel had been his constant through it all. She couldn't help but feel like this trip wasn't just for Rebel, it was for Eddie, too. When they finally arrived at the farm, Linda's breath caught in her throat. The land stretched for acres, blanketed in soft green grass that swayed gently in the wind. A small barn sat near the edge of the property, its red paint faded but welcoming. An older woman, dressed in overalls and a wide-brimmed hat, came out to greet them. "You must be Linda," she said, smiling warmly. "And this must be Rebel." As Rebel stepped off the trailer, Linda watched him carefully, half expecting him to hesitate. But instead, Rebel lifted his head high, his nostrils flaring as he took in the scent of the open fields. He let out a soft whinny and began to walk forward, his steps steady and deliberate. Linda felt tears sting her eyes as she watched him, knowing this was exactly where he belonged. Rebel's hooves crunched softly against the gravel as he stepped out of the trailer, his head held high and ears pricked forward. The open expanse of green fields stretched before him, the gentle breeze carrying the scent of grass and fresh earth. Linda stood motionless for a moment, watching as Rebel seemed to take it all in. He let out a deep, rumbling whinny, the sound carrying across the farm like a declaration of freedom. The older woman in overalls, who had introduced herself as Martha, walked up beside Linda, her weathered hands tucked into her pockets. "He's a beautiful horse," Martha said, her tone calm and reverent. "Horses like him don't just belong in open fields, they thrive here. You did a good thing bringing him." Linda turned to Martha, her chest tightening with a mix of relief and emotion. "It wasn't just me," she replied. "This was Eddie's wish. Rebel was his whole world, and I promised him I'd find a place where Rebel could be free." Her voice faltered as she spoke, the weight of her promise finally catching up with her. Martha nodded knowingly and gestured toward the field. "We've got plenty of space here. He'll be with other rescues, and we'll make sure he gets all the care he needs. I think he'll fit right in." Rebel had already begun to walk toward the open field, his powerful frame moving gracefully as if he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. Linda felt her breath catch as she watched him, the sight both beautiful and bittersweet. As Rebel reached the edge of the pasture, he stopped and turned his head back toward Linda. For a moment, their eyes met. It was a look filled with understanding, gratitude, and a connection that words could never fully capture. Linda felt a single tear roll down her cheek, but this time, it wasn't from sadness. It was from knowing she had done the right thing, not just for Eddie, but for Rebel, too. Before long, Rebel trotted forward into the open field, his tail flicking as he disappeared into the horizon. Linda stood there, the warm breeze brushing her face, and felt an unfamiliar yet comforting sense of peace. She turned to Martha and smiled faintly. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying the gratitude Eddie could no longer express. As Linda walked back to the truck, she looked over her shoulder one last time. Rebel was galloping now, his strong body moving effortlessly through the fields. He was finally where he belonged. The drive back to the hospital was quiet, the hum of the engine filling the space as Linda stared out the window, lost in thought. Rebel's image, free and galloping across the open fields, was etched in her mind. She felt a profound sense of relief, knowing she had kept her promise to Eddie. But as the hospital came into view, a pang of sadness struck her. Eddie wasn't there to see it. When she entered Eddie's room, it was dimly lit, with only the soft glow of the bedside lamp illuminating his still figure. The monitors had been removed, and his hands rested peacefully atop the blanket. Linda felt a lump form in her throat. Eddie had passed while she was away, just as she suspected he might. But even in death, his face held a serene expression. Linda noticed a folded envelope on the bedside table with her name scrawled on the front in shaky handwriting. She picked it up carefully, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside was a short letter written in Eddie's uneven script. "Linda, if you're reading this, it means Rebel made it to where he belongs. I can't thank you enough for keeping your promise. I always felt I let him down in the end, but you gave him what I couldn't, a future. You gave me peace, too. I'm ready now, knowing he's free. Take care of yourself, and don't forget, the bonds we share in this life go deeper than we realize. With gratitude, Eddie." Tears streamed down Linda's face as she held the letter close to her chest. It wasn't just a thank you. It was a final goodbye, a testament to the quiet strength Eddie had carried even in his last moments. She sat down beside his bed, letting the weight of the day sink in. For the first time, she allowed herself to cry fully, not out of sadness, but for the beauty and heartbreak of a life lived with such deep connection. Later that evening, Linda spoke with the hospital staff about Eddie's passing. She shared the story of Rebel, the promise she had kept, and the peaceful way Eddie had seemed to let go. By the end of her recounting, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Eddie's story, and the bond he shared with Rebel, had touched them all in ways they hadn't expected. As Linda left the hospital that night, she paused in the parking lot and looked up at the stars. She thought of Eddie and Rebel, their spirits somehow intertwined, running through the fields together once again. A soft smile spread across her face. "You're free now, Eddie," she whispered. And with that, she drove home, the promise she made now a memory she would cherish forever. The days after Eddie's passing were a blur for Linda, filled with paperwork, phone calls, and moments of quiet reflection. The hospital staff had taken a special interest in Eddie's story, sharing it with anyone who would listen. His bond with Rebel, and Linda's determination to fulfill his final wish, became something of a legend among the nurses and doctors. It was rare, they all agreed, to witness a connection so pure, so enduring. One afternoon, Linda decided to visit the small farm where Rebel now lived. The drive felt lighter this time, the ache of loss softened by the knowledge that Eddie's wish had been honored. When she arrived, Martha greeted her with a wide smile and led her to the pasture. "He's doing great," Martha said. "It's like he's been here his whole life." Linda leaned against the fence, her eyes scanning the field until she spotted Rebel grazing under a large oak tree. He looked peaceful, his coat shining in the sunlight. As if sensing her presence, Rebel lifted his head and turned toward her, his ears flicking forward. Linda couldn't help but smile. "Hey, boy," she called softly. Rebel let out a quiet nicker before returning to the grass, as if to say he was content. Martha handed Linda a cup of coffee and joined her by the fence. "You know," Martha began, "a lot of people think animals don't understand things like loyalty or loss. But that horse, he knows. You gave him something special, and he'll carry that with him for the rest of his days." Linda nodded, the warmth of Martha's words filling her heart. "It wasn't just for him," she replied. "It was for Eddie, too. They deserved this." Before leaving, Linda walked down to the edge of the field, taking a moment to stand under the oak tree where Rebel now spent most of his time. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the letter Eddie had written. Unfolding it carefully, she read it again, the words now etched into her memory. After a moment of silence, she folded the letter and tucked it into a small hollow in the tree, a quiet tribute to the bond between Eddie and Rebel. As she drove away, Linda glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Rebel trotting through the pasture, his head high and his tail swaying behind him. The sight filled her with an unexpected sense of closure. Eddie's story wasn't just about loss, it was about love, loyalty, and the kind of connections that leave a lasting imprint. And in that moment, Linda knew, Eddie's legacy wasn't just in the life he had lived, but in the freedom he had left behind for Rebel. A few weeks after Eddie's passing, Linda received an unexpected call from a lawyer handling Eddie's estate. At first, she thought it must be a mistake. Eddie had often spoken of struggling to keep the farm afloat, and she hadn't imagined he had anything left to give. But the lawyer assured her it was no error. "He left something for you," the man said. "It's not much, but he wanted you to have it." Curious and a little uneasy, Linda agreed to meet the lawyer at his small office downtown. As she sat across from him, he slid a worn leather envelope across the desk. It had Eddie's name etched faintly in the corner, the edges soft and frayed from years of use. Linda opened it carefully and pulled out a handwritten letter along with a folded piece of paper. Her breath caught as she recognized Eddie's unmistakable handwriting. "Linda, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, but I couldn't leave without thanking you properly. You gave me peace in my final days and gave Rebel the life he deserves. I know you said you did it for me, but I also know the kind of heart it takes to do what you did. That's why I'm leaving you the last piece of my farm. It's small, just a couple of acres, but it's yours now. I hope you'll visit it and think of me and Rebel whenever you stand there. You'll know what to do with it. With gratitude and friendship, Eddie." Linda's hands trembled as she unfolded the deed attached to the letter. It was for a small plot of land near what had once been Eddie's farm. The gesture stunned her, not because of its material value, but because of the meaning behind it. Eddie had entrusted her with something so personal, something he had fought so hard to keep. That weekend, Linda made the trip to see the land Eddie had left her. It wasn't much, just a quiet patch of green bordered by a few tall trees, but it felt alive with history and memory. Standing in the middle of it, Linda closed her eyes and imagined Eddie working the fields, Rebel trotting by his side. She could almost hear their laughter in the wind, the echoes of a life well lived. As she stood there, Linda made a quiet decision. She wouldn't let this land sit idle. She would use it as Eddie would have wanted, a sanctuary for animals like Rebel, a place where they could roam freely and live out their days in peace. It wouldn't be easy, and she didn't have the resources yet, but for Eddie and Rebel, she would find a way. For the first time in years, Linda felt a sense of purpose, as if Eddie's gift had ignited something in her she didn't realize she needed. With the sun setting behind her, Linda took one last look around before heading back to her car. As she drove away, her heart felt full, not just from Eddie's generosity, but from the knowledge that their story wasn't over. Eddie's legacy would live on, not just through Rebel, but through the land he had entrusted to her. And in that, Linda found both peace and a new beginning. Months had passed since Linda first stood on the land Eddie had left her, and in that time, her life had transformed in ways she hadn't thought possible. The small plot of land, once quiet and untouched, was now filled with life. Linda had poured every spare moment and every ounce of determination into creating the sanctuary she had envisioned. What began as a promise to Eddie had grown into something much larger, a place of healing and hope, not just for animals, but for herself. The sanctuary, named Eddie's Haven, had quickly become a refuge for animals in need. Local farmers and shelters began bringing retired workhorses, aging dogs, and even the occasional stray goat to Linda's care. Each new arrival reminded her of Rebel and the promise she had made that day in Eddie's hospital room. The sight of animals roaming freely on the land filled her with a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known she was searching for. Rebel, of course, was the heart of it all. He had adjusted perfectly to his new life at Martha's farm, but Linda often visited him, finding comfort in his steady presence. On one such visit, Martha surprised Linda by saying, "You should bring him to Eddie's Haven. It's his home now, isn't it?" The idea took root immediately, and within days, Rebel was grazing in the fields of the sanctuary Eddie had unknowingly inspired. Watching him roam the land Eddie had left her felt like a full-circle moment, as if Rebel's spirit carried a piece of Eddie with him. Word of Eddie's Haven began to spread beyond the local community. Volunteers came forward to help, and donations trickled in from people who had heard Linda's story. One day, a journalist visited to write an article about the sanctuary, captivated by the tale of Eddie, Rebel, and the nurse who had kept a dying man's promise. When the article was published, the sanctuary received an outpouring of support, donations, supplies, and letters from strangers who had been moved by the story. As the sanctuary grew, Linda found herself reflecting on everything that had led her to this moment. She thought about Eddie's quiet strength, his love for Rebel, and the way he had entrusted her with his final wish. She thought about Rebel, the loyal horse who had taught her the meaning of connection and trust. And she thought about the land itself, a small piece of earth that had become a symbol of freedom, resilience, and new beginnings. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, Linda stood at the edge of the pasture, watching Rebel graze alongside the other animals. The golden light bathed the land in warmth, and the sound of crickets filled the air. She closed her eyes and smiled, feeling a profound sense of peace. Eddie's story had ended, but his legacy was alive, carried forward in every life that found solace at Eddie's Haven. In that moment, Linda realized something she had never expected. By keeping her promise to Eddie, she had discovered a new purpose for herself.